Hello there, Ray here, and what I have behind me is an infinite item storage without the use of minecarts. The idea of an infinite item storage was talked about in the ProtoTech chat about a year ago, but I was able to make it into a reality. What this does is allows you to send an infinite amount of items into storage, just by putting these items into the stream. Then, when you want to bring these items back out of storage, you can just flip this lever, and this will allow the items to be sent back to you. The way that this works is that the items are sent along this ice stream out towards this direction. They are continually loaded with the pseudo-entity processing chunks. This will allow the items to continue traveling along that water stream, and once they get out here, the entity processing chunks will stop, and then they'll get pushed over into these lazy processing chunks. And once the item gets moved over into the lazy processing chunk, the items will no longer despawn. But the hoppers are still able to pick up items in lazy processing chunks that are above the hopper. So this hopper here is currently being locked, which goes back to that lever by the player. So if the player would unlock this hopper, which will allow the items to start being picked up by this hopper, and this will allow the items to get sent back into this dropper, which there they will be detected, and then they will be shot back out of this dropper. And since this dropper here is shooting the items over into the entity processing chunks, this will allow the items to be able to travel back to the player. Having the ability to store tons of items without having tons of chests just sitting around is very useful. And this can come up in different situations, such as having tons of dirt in chests, but you don't really want to throw the dirt away. So in this situation, you could just send the dirt off into the lazy processing chunks, where the items will not be able to despawn, but you're still able to retrieve them whenever you want to. The distance in which the items are sent and the chunk loaders are chunk loading is the distance of the render distance of the player plus extra, just so that the player can move around this area without accidentally loading the entities off there, which would cause them to despawn. So here we just have it so that just beyond the player's render distance and a little bit of extra, you can see that it's sitting right there. And I also have a tester, which is just telling me if it's in lazy processing chunk or if it's in an entity processing chunk. And you can see if you get back here, the items will be in a lazy processing chunk, and this will allow the items to not despawn. In situations where you will not use this all the time, and such as the dirt situation where you sent some dirt off and you probably won't retrieve the dirt for a little while, there is a lever here which will allow you to lock all these hoppers, which are chunk loading. So once all these hoppers are locked, they will no longer be able to load the chunks over there, and once the next autosave comes around, the chunks in the distance will no longer be loaded, and you can see that the little tester thing has died off because these chunks are currently being stopped from being loaded just because of the hoppers are being powered. So when it comes time that you want to retrieve that dirt in the distance or your other items that you send over there, you can unlock these hoppers, which will allow them to start chunk loading again. So this will allow the little tester over there to start saying that he's in lazy processing chunks. Then you can come here to this lever, which is locking the hopper, which is underneath of the items, which are being stored in lazy processing chunk. This will allow the items to be shot back out of the dropper and be sent down this ice stream, and they'll eventually be able to be sent all the way through, and they'll be able to reach these hoppers and chests here, so that you can collect your items again. The time it takes for the items to reach back to this destination just depends on how far you have the item stored at, and having the items being pulled out does not affect any other items that are sitting there, so you can lock it at any time, and the items that have not been pulled by the hopper yet will still stay on top of the hopper and will not despawn as well. Another situation where this could easily be used in is where you have a farm that produces quite a bit of items that you do not want to store on hand, but you do want to have a bunch of items stored up, so maybe later on that you can use the items and you can retrieve these items. Such as an iron farm, you may be able to send the iron off and have the iron be stored instead of having it stored in chests. And then at some point you want to craft up a bunch of iron, you can have the iron be sent back to the player here, and then the player can use it at that time. But if it takes quite a while for the items to be sent back from the infinite storage, let's say you can only send one item every second, and your iron farm over here can actually produce one ingot every second, then it's not really feasible to have the items be stored up and be sent back to the player when the iron farm can produce the items at the same rate it takes for the items to be sent back to the player. So in these situations where you want to store a large amount of items back here, and then have the items be sent back to the player relatively quickly so the player can craft them up, I recommend having a setup like this, where we have the items stored up here, then we have a bunch of hopper minecarts, which pull out the items more quickly than just a single hopper. Then they are divided up into many hopper minecarts, which then push them into hoppers, which then push them into droppers, and this way you can drop out the items at a much quicker rate. The way that this works is that the items are pushed over here and pushed up against this cobble wall here, which allows the items to just be far enough into the lazy processing chunk so that they do not despawn. But since the hopper minecarts are entities, they need to be the entity processing chunk to actually pick up items. They are actually slightly more in the entity processing chunk, so therefore they will actually check the items that are actually in the lazy processing chunk, and they will actually be able to pull them out. And here I just have two hopper minecarts which are pulling, which allowed me to divide them in half. And then for every hopper minecart here, I have some other hopper minecarts which pull from them, which allow the items to be divided up more. And the slowest part is the hoppers, which pull out items much slower than the hopper minecarts. So here I have a bunch more hoppers that all point into these droppers here. And then I have these droppers all connected to a hopper or a comparator clock back here. And this comparator clock is normally off, but when you have the power line that goes, the lever that goes back to the player, and then when the player powers that, it will allow this hopper or this comparator clock to turn on, which will allow all the items to be shot out, and then they'll just go down the water stream towards the player. This puts out items at a fairly good pace, but if you do want to autocraft at a quicker speed, you can make this bigger. Just remember to, when you add more hopper minecarts, to try to keep the majority of the hopper minecart on the entity processing side. So these here, you can see they're being held by this end rod here, which allows them to stay on the entity side. So then you can just stack up more. This way you can actually get more items to be sent back to the player at a quicker rate. Now in my scenario here, I just have it connected to spawn chunks, which allow the spawn chunks to load it over there. But I would recommend when you have a typical farm, unless you have your iron farm, which is in spawn chunks, you can just have this getting loaded off of the player's loaded chunks. So let's say you're at your witch hut, and this is where you're normally at. Then you can just load out from your witch hut and have it out there, and have all your items be stored out there, which is really nice. And then if you want to prevent like players from just walking out there accidentally, you probably want to make some kind of border here and remind people not to travel out that way. There is a world download in the description so that you can see this world. I have this larger version as well as a smaller version, so you can check out both versions. There you have it, guys, infinite item storage without the use of minecarts. So if you found this interesting, show me a like. If you'd like to see more amazing contraptions, subscribe, and don't forget to comment. Bye bye!